Good morning. After the opening remarks given by the Director of the National Defense Institute, Major General Vitor Daniel Viana Rodrigues Viana, we are ready to initiate the international seminar, Security Capacity Building in Africa, Has It Ever Worked? This seminar is organized by the National Defense Institute and will take place from 10 to 1 o'clock, consisting on a panel. This panel is entitled Security Capacity Building in Africa, Has It Ever Worked? We'll have as guest lecturers Colonel António Pinheiro, former senior Portuguese representative at the African Center for Security Studies, Dr. Pedro Seabra, research fellow at Giga University, Hamburg, and Dr. Sami Faltas, professor at the University of Groningen. At the end of the seminar, please fill the satisfaction forms and deposit them in the box placed at the hall of the auditorium. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning everyone, welcome. My name is Bruno Cardoso Reis. It's always a pleasure to organize, be present, share events here at the National Defense Institute, and in particular those involving o curso de Defesa Nacional. I usually say to my students when I'm giving classes in English, it's a class in English, not an English class. So obviously this is a session in English, but not a session where the use of English is mandatory. So if for the debate, which will of course be a crucial part of the event, after the initial presentations, we will be free to use Portuguese or English. We'll provide quick translation if need be. And now I think the main thing after this quick introduction, which was already done of our main speakers, is to move forward and to engage with the presentations. We will also have a short coffee break, probably between after the initial two presentations. We will have a short coffee break, and then we can move to the final presentation and to the debate. Where obviously the idea is to allow both the speakers and everyone else to engage with the three presentations. So the first presentation will be by Colonel António Pinheiro. He's widely recognized as one of the foremost experts in security in Africa in Portugal, with experience both as an analyst and as a practitioner in Portugal and abroad. So it's for me a great pleasure to welcome him back to the National Defense Institute, where he was also a researcher, and thank him for the availability to be present here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for your kind introduction. Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to see some familiar faces in the audience. It makes me feel at home. But before jumping into the subject matter, I'd like to thank the National Defense Institute for the invitation that has been extended to me. It is a privilege to be a member of a panel with such distinguished academics. Dr. Pedro Seabra, we've met a while ago, and of course, Dr. Sami Faltas, a great scholar and an old friend, with whom I have been learning so much since we met at the Austrian Schleining Peace Castle. While I was preparing the following presentation, I asked myself about the type of procedural knowledge that could add some value to this plenary. The subject matter of this seminar was framed as a research question, which is often the case within academic best practices. As we know, social scientists are supposed to ask the right question rather than giving you the answer. Some questions contain half the answer, which I think to be the case. And yet, I tend to disagree on a hasty recognition of the endemic failure of security capacity building programs in Africa. So, I kind of dug into my past experience and tried to come up with some successful examples of capacity building programs and processes which I have witnessed since 1999 when I joined the path of international security and development assistance. But first, allow me to frame my analysis with some terminology. According to Plato, the definition of terms is the beginning of wisdom. So, in terms of important definitions, what is a capacity? A capacity could be defined as the ability of an individual or organization to perform assigned duties effectively. This includes human capacity, physical capacity, and institutional capacity. So, what is a capacity building process? Perhaps one possible definition should be a set of programs and processes that empower and enable the recipient's independent development, concluding technical, professional, and personal skills. Capacity building processes apply to both individuals and institutions. Because of the systemic nature of the factors affecting capacity, the very concept of capacity building has to be defined as a set of closely interrelated elements, simultaneously addressing different spheres of influence, such as values, individuals, equipments, institutionals, etc. A strategically designed intervention, hence, seeks to harness the energy of the changes generated in each sphere into a synergetic macro-level change process. And what about the security sector reform buzzword? Well, I think the following presentations will drill down on this concept. Suffice to say that SSR developed along with this shift towards human security. It explicitly emphasized the linkages between security and development. SSR is supposed to be a nationally owned process aimed at ensuring that security and justice providers deliver effective and efficient security and justice services that meet the people's needs. And the security and justice providers are accountable to the state and its people, operating with a framework of good governance, rule of law, and the respect for human rights. So in theory, security sector reform implementation should be about national capacity building. This isn't not only about making public institutions work more effectively, but also about creating agencies that deliver security and justice services in a way that serves the interests of both the state and the population. While SSR itself is a holistic concept, SSR programs are generally undertaken within one specific subsector, mainly because of limited resource and funding. This has obvious consequences to the outcome of SSR programs. Because of its holistic nature, many in the development community are wary of SSR becoming a shield for all kinds of military aid that dislodged national self-determination in order to advance the interests of global powers. As kind of a quick overview on the political environment, before going into the key capacity building providers in Africa. After several decades of unsuccessful development efforts in Africa, the international community has reached consensus that good governance is a critical prerequisite for sustaining development. Good governance is in turn seen as contingent upon environments of developed human and institutional capacities, which has led to a proliferation of capacity building programs. However, due to the dominant prescriptive, supply-driven, one-size-fits-all, and fragmented nature of most such initiatives, the majority have failed to achieve meaningful results. In the last 15 years, the international community has revisited capacity building challenges in the context of its aid effectiveness agenda and outlined a strategy for shifting away from the dysfunctional old paradigm. This New Deal, advocated by development theorists and practitioners, is very similar to the conceptual framework of strategic peace building. Both disciplines acknowledge the need for a long-term, locally owned, demand-driven, and context-specific systems approach to interventions in order to achieve effective and sustainable results. So, who have been the most significant security capacity builders in Africa for the last few years? Let's start with the continental organization, the African Union, and its African peace and security architecture. The Peace and Security Council protocol was adopted back in July 2002 at the Durban Summit, and it outlines the various components of the African peace and security architecture and their respective responsibilities. The architecture consists of 5 key pillars: the Peace and Security Council, Continental Early Warning System, the Panel of the Wise, Peace Fund, and the African Standby Force. So let's focus on the African Standby Force. It is supposed to be a multidisciplinary continental force comprised of military, police, and civilian components, which are on standby in their regions of origin and available to the African Union for employment and deployment. The African Standby Force, it's important to understand, is a vital part of the African Union's ambition to silence the guns by 2020, with African solutions to African problems. In 2013, however, and mainly as a way of easing a severe donor fatigue, the African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crisis, ACERC, was established to provide the continent with a rapid deployment capability ahead of African Standby Forces' fully operational capability. Meanwhile, African Standby Force fully operational capability date has been systematically postponed, and nobody really knows when the next deadline, if any, will be set. Of all the African Union's operations deployed to date, those in Mali and the Central African Republic most closely resemble the African Standby Force theoretical model, where the African Union worked with a region, the ECOWAS and ECAS respectively, to plan and deploy an operation. The activities of the African Standby Force, once functional, will be focusing on conflict prevention and peace building. The ACERC model, on the other hand, is based on experiences such as in the CAR in Mali, and therefore allows for peace enforcement. ACERC is self-funded and based on the voluntary participation of member states, whereas the ASF requires significant AU funding and must coordinate large number of member states. The ACERC force is thus potentially more agile, but with less authority than the African Standby Force brigades. The Amani Africa cycles of field training exercises, which follow the French RECAN concept, the renforcement des capacités africaines pour le maintien de la paix, are mainly funded through the European Union's African Peace Facility. So, what are the challenges? What have been the challenges, the most significant challenges to raise this capability? Number one, funding. Funding has been the key challenge since the architecture's inception. It is now expected that the African Union will contribute 25% of the funding for the African Standby Force. The African Standby Force will remain reliant on external, United Nations, European Union, and bilateral support for 75% of its funding. As an example, since its creation, AMISOM has been fully funded by the European Union. So far, the EU has committed more than 580 million euros to AMISOM. Number two, the African ownership concept. There is a say, we have one in Portuguese too, the one who pays the piper calls the tune. Besides, some international partners have seized on the African Standby Force concept to such a degree that it sometimes is confusing to perceive who is running the show. Number three, lack of coordination and engagement between the African Union and the regions. There has been this protracted fratricide quarrel between the continental level and the regional level. They have not understood that regions should do force generation while the African Union should utilize the force. Number four, what I call the premature Africanization of peace support operations, which hampers a more structured, full-fledged development and self-sustainability of African security sectors at the national level. And finally, the need to build from national to sub-regional and regional. Weak political economic integration dynamics will keep jeopardizing African standby force sustainability. The gridlock in APSA is related more to political will than merely structural and resource scarcity. It's an important conclusion stemming out from my experience across those recent years. Now, let's jump into the European Union role as a capacity builder in Africa. The key EU financial instrument to support cooperation with Africa in the area of peace and security is the African Peace Facility. Capacity building has become a major component of the APF since the facility's establishment. A number of support programs have been rolled out to give the AU and the regional economic communities the necessary capacity to address security challenges. In the area of capacity building, the APF's most important individual contribution are as follows. The APSA support programs. These programs aim at strengthening the capacity and efficiency of the African Union and the regional economic communities to prevent and respond to crises in Africa by implementing and operationalizing the Africa Peace and Security Architecture. A soon-to-be contract for the APSA support program number 3, which covers the period 2016-2018, will financially contribute to the APSA operationalization for an amount of 29 million euros. Number 2, C3 and information systems to support African-led peace support operations. Following the capacity gap detected during the Malian crisis in 2013, the African Union and the EU signed an agreement whereby the APF would provide 12.5 million euros over a 40-month period to acquire and set up the C3IS system for management of African-led peace support operations. Number 3, AU liaison officers. The program aims at supporting the network of African Union liaison officers in conflict and post-conflict countries in Africa. Despite substantial donor support, financing 100% of the AU liaison officers' budget remains a challenge. And finally, the AU Commission salaries in peace and security. The program aims at sustaining the African Union Commission personnel costs working on the implementation of peace and security programs. Mired in its historical role of fund provider and actor in cooperation, the EU remains incapable of creating the right balance between development imperatives and security needs. There are impending issues affecting this so-called partnership among equals. On one side, we have Africans resenting the EU's tendency to project its normative power and promote its own values and agenda in its kind of paternal relationship with the African continent. On the other hand, the EU's colonial legacy and its cultural and complexes within hampers a more objective dialogue in which the donor should be able to demand a bit more from the recipient, more transparency, more accountability, more ownership. Brussels also has to deal with the suffocating bureaucracy that causes severe lack of coordination and assessment of their programs, making their comprehensive approach a thorny process. Be as it may, the need for EU support to African-led PSO will continue in the medium term. Nevertheless, while the APF is the only EU instrument that can fund PSOs, there are doubts about the appropriateness of using European development funds for peace and security activities. Let's go over one or two examples of the USA intervention in Africa as capacity builders. It's important to remember that Africa is not a strategic priority to US national interests. Despite this structural line of orientation, Africa's importance has risen in Washington, and the continent has been flooded with numerous theater security cooperation programs. And by the way, this had nothing to do with the standing up of AFRICOM. AFRICOM was not the new kid on the block, as we may discuss in the following debate. Most of the United States activities are obviously linked to a rise in the terrorist threat level from the continent. Africa is also the testing ground for the leading from behind approach, which is defined as an innovative, low-cost approach relying particularly on the use of drones, special operation forces, and partnerships. The Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Program aims at building institutional capacities of partner countries across the Sahelian band. Despite over a decade of commitment to the sub-region, the events that have destabilized the Sahel over the last years, and we can mention Mali, Libya, and so on, perfectly illustrate the limitations of the US comprehensive and indirect approach that failed to anticipate or adapt to a fragile situation. There's a program, however, that I would like to mention as a good example of a sustainable, integrated, local-owned capacity building program. Back in 2007, following the rise of maritime piracy and narco-trafficking in Africa's coastal waters, the US launched the Africa Partnership Program. APS modular, sequential methodology seeks to improve capabilities with partner naval forces using 4 pillars to increase maritime safety and security. First, developing maritime domain awareness. Second, build maritime professionals. Third, establish maritime infrastructure. And finally, develop response capabilities while building regional integration. Since 2007, APS has progressed from a series of bilateral port visits to a series of regional training engagements ashore and at sea. Now, let's talk only for a couple of minutes on the French approach. It is only fair to acknowledge France's strategic vision when, back in 1995, after the Rwandan genocide, they started to build the foundations of today's African peace and security architecture. Not only they were behind the new African geopolitical map based on the 5 regional economic communities, they started to build 2 structural pillars which supported the operationalization of the 5 African standby brigades. One, the ENVR network, the École Nationale à Vocation Régionale, and the second one, the Recon cycle. Known in France as capacity building at the political, military, or strategic level, French security assistance activities are divided into 2 separate categories: structural cooperation under the aegis of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs, and operational cooperation under the direction of the Ministry of Defense. The goal of the national, regionally based vocational schools, les Écoles Nationales à Vocation Régionale, is to forge a joint venture between France and its African partner, allowing the recipient nation to host a high-quality education center similar to those in France, only at a lower price. These schools promote regional integration as they provide scholarships to students from across Africa. To date, there are 17 ENVRs in 10 partnered nations. Total operating costs for the school network is roughly 11 million euros a year. It used to be 3 times this amount. And why? Because now France has came up with an idea of internationalizing the schools and hence sharing the burden among other partners. For instance, United States and France have recently embarked on a partnership at the French ENVR in Bamako. And the curriculum, centered on peacekeeping, sustains a wide array of students from across the continent. The school is run by a board of trustees with contributions coming from not only France, but also United States, Canada, Germany, Japan, and the Netherlands. Finally, I would also like to talk about the Portuguese experience as capacity builders. Since the beginning of the 90s, run by the Defense Policy Directorate and with the support of the Portuguese Armed Forces, Portugal has been implementing triennial technical cooperation programs with the African Portuguese-speaking countries, and since 2002 with Estimo. Embracing the prevalence of technical assistance as a form of capacity building, the Portuguese military have been able to deliver excellent results by having good local knowledge, building trusting and supportive relationships with counterparts, and truly committed for the long term. As a footnote, sometimes this long-term commitment carries within a potential danger of technical assistance substituting rather than building capacity. We can drill down a bit during the debate on this issue. Due to financial constraints and the attempt to include security assistance programs within the strict official development aid eligibility criteria, education emerged as an effective, low-cost form of capacity building. So we decided to invest on human capital by building a complementary 2-pronged educational system. The first one a local network of military training centers for short-term courses aimed at mid-rank officers and NCOs. And the second one, the International Military Education Program, offering long-term courses at all of the military academies and universities in Portugal. Despite our relative success as capacity builders, it would be inadequate to claim, as I hear often, that we have been successfully doing security sector reform in Lusophone Africa. To hear Portuguese senior political leaders in public interventions insisting on this notion has been quite painful. Not only they neglect our success in building sustainable capabilities and capacities in Africa's security sector, but most importantly, such a claim is perceived by our partners and experts as a sign of utter ignorance. Let us be clear, ladies and gentlemen. We have had some good results in building sustainable capacities in Lusophone Africa, but it does not necessarily mean we have been doing SSR since the inception of our security assistance program. In fact, if we analyze the root causes of many of our failures within security assistance, we may conclude that a more integrated, holistic, nationally owned process operating within a framework of good governance, rule of law, and respect for human rights was precisely the missing SSR framework we should have developed a priori, if not only at the conceptual level. Of course, we have had some failures too. Unlike health or education assistance programs, building standalone, fragmented military capacities in African states with no democratic civilian oversight mechanisms encompasses some risks. Back in 2003, I remember someone saying, well, not to worry, for the Ghanaian battalion we'll be training and equipping for the next 6 months. It's soon to be deployed to Liberia and integrate the ECOMIL peacekeeping force. Indirectly, it's going to be a good thing, for the Portuguese flag is about to be shown in Monrovia. It's worth the shot. And everything looked to be running smoothly while the operation was going on. But everyone seemed to forget that once the mission was over, the force had to return home. They did in fact return home to Bissau in August-September 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And the shockingly abrupt downgrading of the military's living standards could not have been worse. With no food, no salary, no roof to sleep under, the unit acted as they were taught. They joined hands and performed a coup by killing the chairman and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So back to Plato's quest. Who guards the guardians? So let me conclude with, on my assessment, these 5 current major challenges, which are pretty much about to be, I think, debated and analyzed much better than I would have been able to in the following presentations. And without any further ado, allow me to conclude my presentation with this quote. I have some doubts on its African origin, but its paternity is not that important, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to the following debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Coronel Pinheiro. Very, very enlightening. As we would expect, I think it will be a major contribution to the debate. So, quickly moving forward, I'll now give the floor to Dr. Pedro Seabra. He concluded his PhD last year with work, with a lot of field work actually in Africa on these matters. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation of his work. And he's currently a research fellow at the Giga Institute in the University of Hamburg, which is, roughly speaking, the equivalent of our former colonial school here in Portugal. Germany also had briefly a colonial history. And fortunately, the result today is the existence of this great institute on global and regional studies, Giga Institute. So Pedro, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. First of all, allow me to express my appreciation to General Viana, Professor Bruno Reis, and IDN for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back here. And given that this is a topic that, as Bruno said, has attracted quite a bulk of my research efforts in the last few years, I'm really glad I was able to be a part of this event. And of course, more so because I've also been asked to talk a bit about what other actors which have attracted a bit less international focus, might be doing in Africa these days. And I'm talking here more specifically about the case of Brazil in Africa. So in that sense, let me just start by asking out loud some very broad questions. How can we characterize Brazil's efforts in this regard? How well thought out have they been in the last few years? What kind of obstacles have stand in the way of greater effectiveness? And even perhaps more importantly, can they even fit the criteria of what we now consider to be security capacity building nowadays? So these are just some of the very, very, very broad questions that will guide my remarks here today. So first things off, what has Brazil really been doing in Africa in the last few years? Well, as most of you probably already know, the governments of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff aim to bring Africa back into the Brazilian foreign policy agenda. South-South political dialogue, economic and trade opportunities, development assistance cooperation. All of this clearly took the lead and caught the public eye. But there was also a very sustained and renewed interest by Brazilian officials in expanding defense and security ties with African countries, with a clear focus on South Atlantic countries such as Cape Verde, Angola, Namibia, or South Africa, just to name a few. Brazil managed to establish itself very quickly in just a matter of a few years as a very interesting alternative partner to be reckoned with in this domain. So with that in mind, let me just try and point out some of what I think are a couple of features that both demonstrates the depth of Brazil's efforts as well as some of its more defining traits in this domain. The first feature I would highlight here is this lack of an overall guiding framework. Despite the existence of this wholesome package composed by the National Defense Policy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Defense White Book, there is no particular definition of Brazil's security and defense engagements abroad. A very broad conceptualization of defense cooperation is often brought up, but it never really gets into the details of what can or cannot exactly be included in its fold. Likewise, I think the same amplitude can be found in terms of the leadership behind these kind of initiatives. The primary initiative, so to speak, no longer belongs exclusively to the different military branches, like when the Brazilian Navy decided to set up shop in Namibia in 1994 by itself, but rather to the Defense Ministry, which has tried to provide some coordination and planning for every existing initiative. However, it is also still possible to find some structural resistances from the Foreign Ministry over such matters, particularly when trying to bring every national actor to the table at the same time. And all this, of course, while the armed forces still maintain some considerable leeway, but depending on the occasion, of course, and on the target country to be partnered with in Africa. The second feature of Brazil's effort that I would mentioned here, and which in my view, I think somewhat kind of compensates for the first one, was this very clear attempt to provide a semblance of a common formal structure by means of several defense cooperation agreements with African countries since 2003 onwards. A total of 10 defense cooperation agreements, if we count the one already signed with Cape Verde late last year, in October, I think, were thus brought forward in the last few years. And I think two key points can stand out amidst each and every one of these agreements. On the one hand, the list of possible joint activities is clearly stated in all of them, and I'll just read some of them here. High-level visits by civil and military leaderships, meetings between defense institutions and respective staff, exchange of students, visits by each country's armed forces, warships, and aircrafts, implementation and development of defense technology programs, and the list goes on and on and on. It doesn't mean that everything actually takes place or that it will ever take place, for that matter, but it does kind of signal the limits of how far Brazil is willing to go in this area with this specific set of countries. On the other hand, every agreement also clearly emphasizes the notion of local ownership and shared costs for any initiative that might be eventually agreed upon between Brazil and these countries, which I also think somewhat provides a reality check over how this kind of things gets paid for at the end of the day, and in between tones down a bit the rhetoric of Brazil in terms of its assistance ties with Africa in the last few years. The third overall feature of Brazilian efforts in this domain can be found in how Brazil actually provides training and capacitation to African military personnel. And in this case, the primary focus is set first and foremost on providing training in Brazilian institutions in Brazil, especially Army and Navy higher learning institutions, and only secondarily in Africa. And as such, I think we need to make a very clear distinction here. When in Brazil, there is no specific African tailored training. Instead, African military personnel are embedded in wider training initiatives provided to either friendly foreign military nations or to the Brazilian military in general. So no particular surprise here. However, when in Africa, there are some exceptions, and the picture gets a bit more fuzzy. For example, Namibia stands out as a very particular exception given the scope of Brazil's operations on the ground, since it started in 2009, I think, to train the local Marine Corps, in addition to the countless training opportunities that Brazil has been offering to Namibia since 1994 onwards. And a similar route has also been pursued more recently with regards to São Tomé e Príncipe, although on a very much lower scale. And also other further tokens of on-the-ground training can be found in terms of demining training efforts provided both in Senegal and Angola. Yet, I should warn, this all comprise very clear exceptions to the general rule of favoring training in Brazil and not on the ground in Africa. And lastly, in my opinion, a fourth feature would comprise of Brazil's malleability or elasticity, so to speak, in terms of how it can assist or how it has been assisting African countries. And I think that can be found in the institutional support to regional organizations, as was the case with the African Union's maritime strategy, as well as with the Gulf of Guinea multilateral efforts to come up with a common code of conduct against piracy in the region. In both cases, Brazil's expertise was sought out, and it was provided accordingly. But another good example of this elasticity lies also in the association with the disbursement of technical scientific cooperation over maritime affairs, and namely the mapping and delimitation of African continental shelves. And by all accounts, this has really proved to be quite an attracting and popular extra that Brazil has tied into its security forays in the continent, and I think exemplifies different related areas where Brazil has tried to carve a niche of its own in this domain. But despite this four very complex features, so to speak, that I just indicated, I think it's also important to highlight some of the obstacles that have clearly created problems for the intended effectiveness of Brazilian efforts in recent years. And the first one is quite striking: language. When providing capacitation in Brazilian institutions, for instance, the exclusive use of Portuguese has brought around some problems for non-Lusophone problem. Stories abound over Senegalese soldiers enrolled in Brazilian training programs in Brazil and how they were not able to complete the intended courses. And of course, this takes a toll on the reputation of the overall training programs offered by Brazil, and does little to demystify the notion that Brazil favors African Lusophone countries' military over elements from other countries. A second obstacle is the lack of resources and irregular funding behind Brazilian efforts. And this is perhaps a bit complicated, but let me try to sum it up down. Given the lack of an overarching legal framework to directly transfer resources abroad in Brazil nowadays, the Brazilian Cooperation Agency, the ABC, which is in charge of overseeing foreign military training programs, is forced nowadays to resort to occasional financial transfers through the United Nations Development Program Office in Brasilia and then back to the ABC in order to pay for and maintain such initiatives. This is a bit of a legal limbo in Brazil, but of course also raises a lot of questions in terms of transparency and predictability regarding the overall cooperation drive that Brazil tries to sell in Africa. And a third and final obstacle lies in the rather constant dependence on the goodwill of each branch of the armed forces, of the Brazilian armed forces, as well as on the fluctuations of the country's foreign policy / defense policy agenda. And these can all be classified as internal structural conditions, so to speak, but the recent economic crisis and political disarray that has come to be well known by everyone has also had a considerable impact on operations on the ground, as well as on the other initiatives that were being planned with some of these countries and with other new potential partners in Africa. Still, after all this is said and done, and just to try and circle back to my initial questions, can we really speak of a Brazilian model of security capacity building? I think that's probably the main question here today for me. Well, I would say that the jury is still pretty much out on that question. There are certainly features that point to some degree of innovation, with the country going beyond the mere train and equip modalities of traditional security and defense cooperation, and of course thus getting closer to what more updated conceptualizations of capacity building appear to indicate. And also there is this official, at the very least, emphasis on local ownership and demand-driven initiatives that is clearly appealing to African officials nowadays, and it's quite hard to deny its existence. However, in my opinion, there are also some indications that Brazilian efforts might be more easily labeled as a case of emulation of good practice by other actors, rather than an entirely original approach on its own. And I think that's an issue that's probably worth further exploring in the debate. On the other hand, even though no one denies that Brazil has demonstrated a great timing and awareness over what African countries require, that has also not necessarily translated itself into absolute success. There have been some positive outcomes, to be true, yes, but there's also been some not so successful ones under its belt. For example, when Brazil failed to implement a technical cooperation mission in Guinea-Bissau between 2008 and 2010, to help reform the local security sector, and which failed, or when considering the case of the Atlantic Tidings joint naval exercise, which was supposed to bring together Brazil, Angola, Namibia, and South Africa in one joint naval exercise, but for the last 3 years, to no success. And in both cases, in my view, the willingness to devise these new modes of engagement with African partners was ultimately undermined by contingencies and obstacles that could have been prevented with more fine-tuned assessments of local geopolitical sensitivities and realities. Still, as fluid and rather mixed as this evaluation might sound, I think it also presents a couple of challenges to the remaining international partners in terms of how best to respond to such developments and how best to engage with Brazil in this particular domain. And I think here two key issues should be taken into consideration here. The first one clearly involves recognizing that African countries are choosing or chose to partner with Brazil for a reason, namely because Brazil had something to offer and addressed their concrete capacity building needs. Whether maritime technical expertise or specific military training, certain niche areas were not evidently covered by traditional security suppliers, thus causing African countries to look elsewhere. That to me seems rather obvious, and overlooking these intricacies of this supply and demand dynamics will ultimately prove counterproductive if the goal is to provide any effective new assistance to African countries. And the second issue involves acknowledging the long-standing presence of Brazil in Africa, while also understanding why its past experiences on the ground have successfully endured over the years. Brazil has now been in Namibia for over 20 years, and it's not going anywhere. Brazil has now a permanent mission in Cape Verde and is trying to establish one in São Tomé and Príncipe, and it's also not going anywhere. And I think, although still not very well known, Southern-led initiatives have existed for a while now and are increasingly competing for the same space as Western ventures and initiatives. So this kind of dynamics of competition between old and new initiatives has to be taken into account, and we really have to bear in mind who are we to focus on. In my view, to explicitly ignore these inroads only adds fuel to this divide, imaginary divide, that has permeated many external engagements with Africa. And perhaps more problematic, it defeats the purpose of capacitating local security sectors in an efficient fashion and addressing shared security problems. And that's probably the final note that I would like to leave here. Increased coordination between existing capacity building approaches would surely allow such goals to be met more effectively and more efficiently. And I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pedro, for this very interesting non-Western-centric kind of approach to cooperation and capacity building in Africa. And now I think we are all ready for the coffee break, so I would ask you to be back here around 10 minutes, and then we will move on to the final presentation and debate. Thank you. Again, good morning and welcome for those of you who are not here at the beginning. We will now move on to the final presentation by Professor Sami Fouters from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He is of course Egyptian-born, so we have an African in the panel. Not indispensable, but in any case interesting. But of course, his CV speaks for itself. He has done a lot of work on this topic, not just in Africa, but more broadly. And I think the title in itself shows that we will have a very interesting presentation, not a mission impossible. So I'll give the floor now to Professor Sami Fouters. Thank you.
Thank you. Bon dia. I'm happy to be with you, dear colleagues. I'm very grateful to the Instituto de Defensa Nacional for inviting me. I'm a bit embarrassed that you seem to all be speaking English because of me, but I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about that now. Like you, I'm a student of defense and security. And yet, I won't speak about defense and security today. I would like to share with you some insights and lessons from the development community. Not the defense and security community, but the development community. Why? Because those people know more about capacity development than we do. They've been working in this field, facing these challenges for decades now. They've made thousands of mistakes, and they're trying to learn from these mistakes. They've formulated lessons learned. Of course, to formulate lessons learned and then to apply these lessons are two different things. But still, in struggling with this challenge, they are miles ahead of us. And so we would be foolish if we didn't learn from them and see what can be applied in security capacity building. And I will claim that basically the same rules apply if you're fighting terrorism or if you're fighting poverty. I'm sure you know this old saying, give a man a fish and he will eat today. Teach him how to fish and he will eat fish every day of his life. He will eat every day of his life. This saying is true, but it's only potentially true. There are many things that can go wrong and prevent him from being able to put food on the table for himself and his family in this capacity development. And I think it's useful to look at the things that need to be in place for this food strategy to work. The easiest level is the level of the skills and the tools. Does he have a fishing net? Does he know how to fish? Does he have the ability to fish? Does his health allow him to go and fish, etc.? If these things are in place and remain in place for 25 years or more, then these conditions have been met. But they aren't the only conditions. Equally important, and even more difficult, are motives, preferences, attitudes. Does he want to eat fish every day? Does his wife? Do his children? If they're Portuguese, maybe yes. But not everybody wants to eat fish every day. And there are other cultural norms and values. Is it considered fitting for him to go out fishing every day? Some communities have ideas about certain professions which belong to certain groups. So, for instance, there are certain ethnic groups which are associated with hunting and certain ethnic groups which are associated with farming, and fishing may be an entirely different group. So these norms, these values, these preferences will all influence this food strategy over time. And these conditions are more difficult to assess and to influence. Finally, we must consider his surroundings. Do they form an enabling environment? Now, this is development jargon. Enabling environment. It simply means surroundings which are favorable for what you want to do. Can he always go to the river? Will he meet no obstacles or dangers? Will nobody stop him? Will the river always yield enough fish of good quality? And will nobody interfere or steal his catch from him? If our man faces an environment which is not enabling but hostile, the capacity building will not lead to the desired results, or maybe only for a short time. These are the most difficult conditions to meet of all. It's not easy to ensure an enabling environment, especially in a country suffering from instability. Now, we're talking about an individual man, and I've included his family, because in Africa you're never alone. We didn't talk much about organizations, but I'll come to those. But you see how important the environment is. This idea of you learn how to fish and you will have food every day of your life will only work if the environment permits. In the real world, of course, foreign aid for the development of capacity usually focuses on organizations, which may be big, small, public, private. The effectiveness on these organizations depends both on individual people at the bottom level and the wider environment at the top level. If we seek meaningful and durable change, we cannot focus only on the organization. I'm a trainer most of the time. I train people on things like security sector reform. That's how I met Antonio Pinheiro in Austria several years ago. And after each training, I wonder, so what have we achieved? Great people, great conversations. Now they go home. Now what happens? And we have no idea. Sometimes I have the pleasure of meeting a former student again, and I learn at least as much from my students as they learn from me. But in truth, in honesty, it's very, very hard to tell. And while this applies in general in education, teacher never really knows what he or she is achieving exactly. It's particularly true when you're doing vocational training for people from many, many different countries, including developing countries where things can change very rapidly. A bright young woman you trained last week will go back home. Will she apply the skills that you tried to convey? Will she apply the insights that she developed in the training course? We never know. She could become an entrepreneur. She could emigrate to Canada. She could die. She could be promoted and do a very different kind of job. So the question of sustainability and of the actual applicability of the training is a very difficult and painful one. Now, there's a very influential scholar of development called Alan Kaplan, who he looked at NGOs, and he distinguished 6 levels at which you can seek to develop capacity or to promote the development of capacity. Because I'm assuming we are the donors, we don't develop capacity, we don't build capacity. We help those who seek to improve their capabilities. And he has this level of this classification, taxonomy of 6 levels, which starts at a very high level with your understanding of the world and your attitudes towards the outside world and how you interact with the outside world, then your vision and your strategy, the structure of your organization, the form should then flow from the content of what we just discussed. And it's only then that you really start talking about skills and material resources, the tools which will enable you to work effectively. The trouble is, of course, that we tend to focus very strongly or even exclusively on training and equipment. And I'm very happy that Antonio, in his talk, already anticipated several of the points that I want to make this afternoon. I was privileged to be involved in some discussions between the Netherlands government and the Burundian government. This is actually about security. They got me, maybe because I speak French, to be a kind of facilitator in a dialogue between the Dutch government and the Burundian government about a program for security sector development, as they called it. which is SSR in a different name, by a different name. And the dialogue began with the Burundians saying, we have great security problems in our country. We would appreciate your help. We're very glad to hear that the Netherlands is willing to help us. What we need is cars, fuel, computer, and operational training. And I was quite happy to hear the Dutch respond in a way which I thought was helpful. They said, well, we understand that you need these things, but you see, we're not car dealers or computer dealers. We try to support international development. So let's talk about how you're going to use these cars, how you're going to use these computers, how you're going to use this training. What's your policy? What's your security concept? What's your defense review? And the Burundians were equally frank and equally honest. And they said, well, we have all these documents, but quite frankly, they're very poor. Like many things in Burundi, they're very poor. You wouldn't consider these to be a real defense review or a real security concept. So the Dutch said, well, would you like us to assist you in the development of these policy documents? And the Burundians said yes. And that's how this program started. Of course, it ended very unhappily because a few years ago, Burundi, the crisis broke out again. There was violence in the streets of Bujumbura, and a lot of the progress made in this program was lost. That's not to say that it was a bad program. I don't think it was a bad program. It made some mistakes, but essentially it got a number of things right because it had learned a few of the lessons that I'm going to talk about. So, from an initial request for cars, computers, training, etc., it went on to a strategic dialogue with a long-term view in which the Dutch were always very careful to say, we're talking about your country, you need to lead, you need to say what's appropriate, you need to say what will work, you need to say how we can help you. And the emphasis was on ownership by the country concerned. And then a year later, they called me again, and it was to look at the development of a defense review. This dialogue had now moved on, and the Burundians were now in the process of developing a defense review. What is a defense review? How do you write it? Who do you get involved? What should it contain, etc.? How do you use it? And we had an official from the French Ministry of Defense who was speaking much too fast and had far too many slides, and I was a bit worried as the facilitator. And then he pulls out a letter by François Sarkozy, which he starts to read. And I thought, is he going to read this whole thing? And he did. But actually, I was happy that he did, because it was an interesting letter. First of all, it was interesting because it was very forceful. By the 31st of December, you will deliver the following, 1, 2, 3, 4. By the 1st of April, you will report to me on your progress in the following areas, ta, 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 ta. It was very, very forceful, very, very detailed. And it clearly indicated to the Burundians and everybody, including myself, that a big operation like this, which requires many agencies to work together, which they don't do naturally and easily, requires the detailed and forceful instructions from the number one, the head of government. In France, that's the president. And it was very, very detailed. Interagency cooperation is always a difficult issue in all countries. Some countries are a little bit better at it than others. So this was a very interesting lesson about getting such reforms going. Now, you'll notice that I used the word capacity development. Now, in a certain sense, it doesn't really matter what we call these things. But the interesting thing is why people like to make this distinction between capacity development and capacity building. Capacity building, as Antonio said, is usually associated with quick, limited, focused rather technical support operations involving more or less standard products. This is the training course we delivered in Liberia. Now we're going to deliver it in the Central African Republic. We'll just get interpreters to put it into French. The focus is very much on deliverables. It's driven by donors. Now, to say that it's driven by donors doesn't necessarily mean that it's useless to the recipients. The donors are not always wrong in their perceptions of what the host country needs. But the priorities usually lie on the side of the donors who say, we have to do something about the crisis in Libya, we have to do something about the crisis in Mali. Let's talk to the Malians and see if we can do this or that, and if the Malians say yes, we do it. It doesn't mean that it's being done against the will of the Malian government. It simply means that the initiative and the priority and the drive is coming from the supply side and not from the demand side. And of course, such programs seek buy-in. This is an American expression which, frankly, I don't like very much. Because buy-in, it's like a company. You know, I have a company, I want to involve you in my company, and I invite you to buy shares in my company. You buy into my company. It still remains my company. Buy-in, in my understanding, is something quite different from ownership. If you own something, if it's your company and your problem, and I'm becoming your partner and will seek to support you in your endeavors, you remain in charge, you remain in the driver's seat. I think Antonio also used the term one size fits all. So this is what's usually associated with capacity building. And it's a bit of a caricature, and it's not fair to all attempts at capacity building, but this is the perception of what capacity building is. Capacity development is then associated with long-term commitments. When the Dutch decided to support Burundi, they said, we're a small country, let's find another small country that we can help, we can limit our assets, even though the Netherlands is a rich country, it can't help many, many countries in this field, so let's help one country and do it well. And they realized that doing it well meant going for the long haul. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So this is what the Dutch were seeking to do in Burundi. Long-term commitment, driven by demand and locally owned, seeking specific solutions, not one size fits all. But if you're dealing with the Central African Republic, you're going to need to look for solutions that work in the Central African Republic, and only the Africans will be able to tell you what will work in their country. And if that strikes you as a bad idea, well, then maybe you can't help them at all. But what you can't do is simply impose your solutions. That will not work. Technical and functional capabilities. What's the difference between technical and functional capabilities? A technical capability is, for instance, the ability to if you're training police, the ability to arrest a suspect, apprehend a suspect, detain a suspect, etc., and to do this in a professional and proper fashion according to best police practice. That's a technical skill. A functional skill is managing people, managing money, reporting, etc., etc. So you need both functional and technical skills. Very often the train and equip programs focus very much on technical skills instead of functional capabilities. Finally, capacity development seeks to improve governance and accountability. I think we all realize now the absolutely essential significance of governance, how countries are governed, are ruled, how institutions are led. And of course, in the security sector, accountability is even more important than in other sectors. This is one area where we have a difference between security cooperation and other cooperation. If you're carrying out a health program, if you're supporting a health program in, say, Kenya, and the program goes wrong, what's going to happen? Well, maybe some patients will suffer and money will be wasted. But if you're training the police or the military in Kenya and the power, the enhanced power which you are giving them is abused, is used in illegitimate fashion, the consequences could be even worse than a health program going wrong. Accountability is perhaps most difficult to achieve where it is most needed, in the security sector. Another specific characteristic of the security sector is that it is highly, highly political. And I was very happy to see this explicitly spelled out in an OECD handbook on security system reform, as they call it. SSR is highly political. You have to face the fact. There's no getting around it. You can't escape it. Because it's about power, it's about the use of violence, it's about security, etc., etc. Changing relations, changing structures, changing cultures and organizations in the security sector will give more power to some people and less power to others. Hence, it is highly political. Hence, it will be supported by some and enthusiastically welcomed by some and opposed or even fought by others. This is a fact of life that you will have to deal with from day one. And it's slightly different in the security sector than it is elsewhere. Now, going back to the general ideas of capacity development, there is a circle which UNDP has defined. It's not very surprising. It starts with the engaging of stakeholders. Stakeholders, people who have something to gain or to lose in a certain project. And as a sideline, let me point out to you that I believe donors are stakeholders. Donors are stakeholders. They have something to lose in a program. It's perfectly legitimate for a donor to say in a dialogue about a program, you know, my friends, to us, this element is very, very important. It's your country. At the end of the day, you will determine the program and you will run the program. But if this element is not a success, at some stage we won't be able to help you anymore because our parliament is going to say what you're doing is very different from what you announced. So please don't forget that this is important to us. It's totally legitimate for donors to do this. There is donor conditionality. Donors don't spend money which comes out of their own pocket. They spend public money. They have to account for this money to their parliaments. So of course there are strings attached. Donor conditionality is completely normal. And the more honest and above board you are about this, the better it will be. So engaging the stakeholders, they must decide, the people on the ground must decide what their needs are, what their capacity needs are, what is needed, what is appropriate, what will work. They own and drive the program. And they will carry on, or not carry on, when we leave, we the donors. That's the acid test of sustainability. What happens when the donors go? So this is assessing the stakeholders to ensure that ownership is given. Now, ownership typically is weak at the beginning of a program. It's sad, but true. Like the Burundians, many countries will need help simply to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and to take the responsibility of leading and managing the program. Many countries can't do this, and they will honestly tell you, this is one of the great things about Africans, you know, they're just pretty straightforward about their problems and their achievements, and they will tell you, we don't know how to do this. So This is the engaging the stakeholders. The next stage is assessing capacity and needs. And the only important point I want to make here is you need to determine what is already there. In train and equip programs, very frequently, one assumes there is nothing, and we must take to them the tools for the job to be done. But there is always something already there. And if you can build on what is there, and what is familiar, and what is legitimate, and what is accepted, and what works, even if it seems to you very amateurish and very primitive compared with the sophisticated systems you have at home, your chances of success are going to be better than if you introduce your sophisticated approach. When you formulate a response, when you formulate your capacity development program, you will probably use the logical framework. Logical framework. Those of you who know something about development work all know these logical frameworks. All big development organizations have them. It's a hell of a job to write them. And when you've done it, you're really very glad that you did, because it brings out all the difficulties, all the muddled thinking, all the mistakes in your program, all the logical errors become visible. If I do this, will it contribute to that? Yes. And if so, what else do I need in order to make this a success? And this goes up and up until you reach your objectives, which are the results that you hope to deliver, the program results that you hope to deliver. And these will contribute to some great, beautiful goal in the sky, but that's not something which you deliver. This is a logical framework, and it's an incredibly useful tool. This is used in formulating the response. The implementing, you know what implementation means. I just want to point out that part of implementation is monitoring. Evaluation is not something you only do at the end of the program. It needs to be something that you monitor throughout the program. When it comes to evaluation, finally, stage 5, I'd like to point out two things. First of all, there's outcome and there's impact. Development people will tell you outcomes and impact, very different things, very different things. You have a training program, outcome, 1,000 people have been trained. Wonderful. Congratulations, 1,000 people have been trained. What impact has that had? We don't know. Well, you're going to have to find some way of at least estimating what kind of impact that had, because otherwise your members of parliament, who are growing increasingly sophisticated in assessing these programs, will say, you know, we're not convinced that training 1,000 people in this context has had a useful impact, and you haven't changed our mind. Very difficult. What impact does training have? What impact does modernization have? What impact does reform have? Difficult but important. And then you have indicators of success. Indicators of success. Very important, because what gets measured gets done. Project staff, people who are carrying out projects, are no fools. They look at the program and they look at the indicators of success and they say, aha, this is what we need to do in order to be considered successful in this project. So let's make sure that we deliver these things. In a previous life, I used to look a lot at weapons collection programs in post-conflict areas. And most weapons collection programs had as an objective, collect 3,000 weapons. Okay, we've collected 3,222 weapons. Program success. What impact does that have? We're not arms traders. We're not interested in the weapons per se. We were collecting these weapons with a certain objective, namely to improve public security. So have we actually improved public security? That's the difference between an outcome and an impact. So if you want to judge the success of a weapons collection program, maybe you want to look at the number of firearm-related injuries. Or maybe you want to look at whether people feel safer than they did before the program, which means that you need to have a measurement before the program, which serves as your baseline, and a measurement after the program, so that you compare the two. This is all bread and butter of development politics. Not so much, I think, of security assistance programs, but it probably needs to be. I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, and I'd like to point out some core issues. These are problems, according to OECD, which always recur in capacity development: institutional arrangements, leadership, which is basically related to ownership, knowledge, accountability, and sustainability. I've mentioned most of these. Knowledge is not merely the knowledge of technical matters. It's also the knowledge of your country's priorities. That might seem blindingly obvious and straightforward in a country like Portugal, but it's not if you're dealing with an underdeveloped country, where the various ministries don't talk to each other, let alone work together. They are each little kingdoms run by ministers who've been appointed for one political reason or another, and they don't talk to each other, they don't work together. So what are priorities? Each will tell you that, of course, his ministry's priorities are number one. Very difficult. And to resolve this problem is not a matter of research, it's a matter of political leadership. You need the government to say, the head of government to say, our priorities for 2017 are 1, 2, 3. And then there are lots of other important things that we're working on, but for 2017, these are the 3 most important things that we definitely do not want to neglect. Now, these lessons I've been talking to you about have been drawn and published in big conferences like the Paris Declaration of 2005, which talks about donor alignment and donor harmonization. Donors will always tell you, we want to sing from the same hymn book. We want to work together. The Dutch and the Portuguese and the Germans and the Danes and the Americans are all in this country, all trying to serve the same purposes. We need to work together. Well, they don't. The sad truth is that they don't. They meet and they drink coffee and they talk and they resolve to do this and to do that. But at the end of the day, there is very little coordination. And that's not because these people are bad or stupid, but they are working under conditions which makes it very difficult for them to actually coordinate. If the German parliament tells the government, we want a public anti-AIDS program in Kenya, and the Belgian parliament tells its government exactly the same thing, then it's very hard for the German and the Belgian governments to coordinate in such a way that they don't duplicate their work, because they have an almost identical assignment from their parliaments. Donor coordination is very difficult and is often unsuccessful beyond the realm of words. Accountability, mutual accountability for development results. Focus on development results and measure them. I think by now you understand what I mean by development results. Training 1,000 people is not a development result. Showing that by training 1,000 people you have sustainably improved the capacity of this organization to do the following things, that is a development result. The Accra Agenda for 2008 had very similar resolutions. There's no shortage of beautiful resolutions passed by countries on the need for better aid effectiveness, better coordination. The problem is that many of these things are not well implemented. So, Alan Kaplan, whom I mentioned before, advocates two big changes, which he calls paradigm shifts. We academics love the word paradigm. It really means the basic idea on which something is founded. The first paradigm shift which he advocates is you need to tackle the intangible. Don't focus too much on training, don't focus too much on equipment. Look instead at the organizational, cultural, political factors, the environment in which you are operating. It's easy to focus on the training and equipment, but it's much more difficult and much more significant to work higher up. So the quality of organizations and the enabling environment are perhaps the two most powerful factors which will determine the success of capacity development. They are also the most difficult, the most controversial, and the least visible. So why, he asks himself, do we keep focusing on training and equipping, whereas we know that it's a very limited approach that could easily go wrong, and often does go wrong? Well, it's very tempting for various reasons. We offer what we have. We have these courses, we have these trainers, they're highly paid, let's use them. You know what? Send them to Afghanistan, send them to Iraq, send them to Mali. It's quick and easy. It can be counted. It can be monitored. Write a little evaluation for your parliament saying, yep, we delivered this, we delivered that, program successful. It offers photo opportunities. I know it sounds funny, but these things are important to politicians. They want to be in the newspaper, they want to be on television. 25 trucks delivered by the Netherlands to Burundi looks much more exciting in television news than improving the transparency and accountability of Parliament. Whereas maybe improving the transparency and accountability of Parliament is much more important than those 25 trucks. But it doesn't look so good on the television news. And frankly, politics is a headache. To get involved in, it's bad enough being involved in Portuguese politics or Dutch politics, but to get involved in the politics of Mali or the Central African Republic is an even bigger headache, mostly because we don't understand it. And yet, there's nothing we can do unless we have a basic understanding of what's happening there politically. So this focus on train and equip is tempting but dangerous. The second paradigm shift he is advocating is you need to be specific. A capacity development program for Mali is not the same thing as a capacity development program for Libya or Iraq. Different country, different people, different history, different situation. You can't simply take something off the shelf. It takes much effort, it takes much dialogue, it takes much time. That's another factor which Antonio mentioned. You need to go for the long haul. Capacity grows slowly, and the locals need to be in the lead. So, just to recap a few of my points, ownership is absolutely key. If the program is not locally owned and driven by the people of the country concerned, it's unlikely to come up with appropriate solutions. It's unlikely to have the support which it needs in the population, and it's pretty sure to fail once the donor money dries up. So local ownership is key, and it's also the most important condition for the sustainability of the project in the future. Accountability. If you are enhancing the power of the security sector, which maybe doesn't even deserve the name security sector, but not at the same time ensuring that the policemen and the intelligence service and the military are accountable to civilian leaders and accountable to Parliament, you may be doing more harm than wrong. Accountability is key. And sustainability, finally, I've mentioned it a few times. Let me mention it one last time. If you want your program to last longer than your presence in the country, you have to make sure that the country wants to sustain it, can sustain it, has the wherewithal in order to sustain it. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. Again, a very interesting presentation. I think we have lots of topics to discuss, so I'm looking forward to the questions and comments from you here in Lisbon and also from Porto. I would point to a couple of things that are obviously very important. One is this whole notion of the need to really engage with the problem of not just simply sharpening the blade without any consideration for its potential misuse. Colonel Pinheiro pointed to a concrete example of that. You can create a very effective force, but then it can actually be misused, and of course Sami Faltas also made references to that. The second one is this whole debate about ownership and accountability. So what exactly is the role of donors? They definitely have to have a role, and it's to be expected that they have a role. At the same time, you need to involve obviously locals and to have local ownership. So who is setting the agenda? What is the balance there? And the third one is this whole debate about sustainability. So what are really the long-term, what is the long-term impact of all of this? It's obviously not a success if you simply create a program which actually achieves certain deliverables or outputs, but then they simply disappear, and after the donor money is taken away. So you definitely need to have this engagement with locals at the level of agenda setting and ownership, targeted programs for specific local programs, so that they would be sustainable in the long term. And we have this wider question, which obviously was a provocation and was partly already engaged by some of the speakers. Where do we really have examples of success? So what would constitute success in these cases? So I'll leave those maybe for a generic comment by the speakers at the end if they want, but now I would open the floor to questions here in Lisbon and in Porto. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or your plaque, and I will give you the floor. We have one there. So maybe we'll...
Thank you very much. These representations were quite good. So I have a lot of questions, but I will try to resume. I have a shared question both to Colonel Antonio Pinheiro and to Professor Sami. And my first question is, what is missing so that we can go to this shift of paradigm? Because nothing of this is new. Indeed, and I was, from my experience in the European Union work in the security sector reform, we discuss already the things, but then when pathing from theory to practical, what we do is completely the opposite. And the first questions I was asked when preparing a mission was, what is this going to cost me? How many years this is going to take? What is the end strategy? And I don't believe this is the good questions. So in the opinion of both, what is missing, what is lacking? Because we talk about the difficulty of ownership in the countries of the destiny, but we have also lack of ownership and of clear ideas and of long-term commitment in our own countries. And maybe more for Colonel Antonio, from your experience, it will be easier to start on a bilateral level or at a multilateral level? Then for Pedro Seabra, I just have one question because I discovered that we are investigation and researching more or less in the same area. I have done a lot of research in Brazil, in South Atlantic, and for them the concept goes from one side to the other. I quite agree that they don't have a framework, but I guess they have an idea in mind, and I would like to know if you share the same opinion. They try to intervene in order to avoid the need for third parts of outside parts of South Atlantic in the area. And my second question for Pedro Seabra, very quickly, is do you think that in the last years there has been a more coordinating activities in programs between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Exterior Relations, namely in what regards to activities in Africa? Thank you very much.
Okay, great questions. Maybe we'll collect one other because we have already a lot of material here. If we have another question now, we will give you the floor. Otherwise, we'll give the floor to the speakers, maybe following the reverse order, so maybe we'll start with some.
Theory and practice don't match in international development. What you're saying sounds very familiar to me. I remember we had a course on security sector reform several years back, and I was talking about assessment and assessment studies and how you start on the back of an envelope with some simple things, and then you make a sort of fact-finding trip, etc., and then you come to a decision: is this a program that we can usefully support, and if so, how? And somebody working for the EU Commission said, you know, this sounds wonderful. I wish we could do this in reality. In reality, what happens is we're told there's going to be a program in Guinea-Bissau. Now go and design it. Never mind whether it's feasible, never mind whether the EU can play a useful role, etc., etc. The political decision has been taken. That's how we start. Well, if you work this way, you will never have local ownership. If you work this way, you will have plenty of programs that fail because the basic preconditions for the success of these programs are lacking. So you're going to have to change your manner of operation. Second example, I mentioned donor coordination between donors, why that often fails. It will continue to fail as long as the decision-making is done in the capitals before any kind of consultation takes place. Now, if you could have a joint donor visit or a joint donor study going to a country like Libya, which clearly needs help, we just don't know for sure whether outsiders are really in a position to help in Libya, to study the situation in Libya and then to come with some very good recommendations to the donor community, then they could sit down and say, okay, now if the Germans do this and the Dutch do that and the Danish do that, maybe the Portuguese can do this, then maybe you could have a decent consultation and coordination before the fact and not after the fact, which is usually impossible. So I'm afraid that donors and implementing agencies are going to have to change a number of their practices.
All right. So I guess I totally concur with the opinions expressed by Sammy. What is missing? It's the billion-dollar question. I think from my only experience, Sammy pointed out, and he used the term, the enabling environment. I recall the last time I've been to the European Union in Brussels. the simple mention of the EU security sector reform in Guinea-Bissau was almost a crime. It was like as if the organization had become really traumatized by this utter failure in terms of SSR. If you ask me what was missing, what has failed, basically there was no ground to build on. You need to have something similar to a proto-state, an embryonic something. And whereas in Guinea-Bissau, by the time the EU decided to go forward with the SSR program, there was nothing similar to a state waiting for the technicians. And number two, what is missing? Perhaps a longer-term commitment from the part of the international community. I think, as we know, this kind of decisions of engaging resources, national resources, into some kind of capacity building program is very much dependent upon the electoral cycles, and politicians tend to look for immediate photo opportunities rather than committing public resources through periods longer than 4 or 5 years. For they know that if they do so, they are creating the environment for excellent photo pictures to their successors, which is not smart from the strategic political point of view. So it's very unfortunate because we know the root causes, we know how to fix it, but in terms of reality, that's what we have. Now, as for the second question, the bilateral approach versus the multilateral, I think we actually have to do both. But in my opinion, if I have to choose, I would definitely try to come up with a better integrated coordination between a few donors in order to address structural endemic shortfalls within national security sectors. You remember I pretty much used the premature Africanization of peace-supporting operations in most of my presentations. What do I mean by that? Instead of working on these capacities, which are quite short-term and not sustainable when the need for it is over, we should start by developing some institutional capacity into each one of the nations that are inserted in a specific regional economic community. Now, in Africa, there's much more this perception that even if you don't have the resources and even if you don't have the skills and capacities at the local level, the regional economic community is supposed to fill that gap. And it's hard to make African leaders understand that actually regional capacities at the level of security and defense are a direct result of each one of its nation's contribution. So instead of being worried on the next peace support operation led by the AU, which, by the way, will be fully funded by external donors, we should lower a bit our investment, our funding at the regional level, and perhaps try to come up with a joint vision into a specific region of the real shortfalls within each one of the national contexts. That's my opinion on this.
Thank you so much for your two questions. When I was talking about the lack of a framework, I was actually just to keep on point, because I was actually talking about the lack of the very own definition of what Brazil considers to be defense cooperation. And just to give another example, I was just now thinking about this, but for many Brazilian officials and even academics, they consider their peacekeeping efforts as part of defense cooperation, of the overall cooperation that they provide to Africa. So that is a problem from where I'm standing in terms of defining what they do, in terms of comparing with other actors what they do in Africa. But I completely agree with you with the whole notion of the South Atlantic, for South Atlantic countries being the main idea driving all these efforts in the last decade. It was clearly that. And the notion of trying to prevent that Western/Northern actors would keep having the same leading position in these sort of activities. And we are talking here a lot about Guinea-Bissau, and even the EU mission in Guinea-Bissau was heavily criticized by Brazil when the EU cut funding for Guinea-Bissau after the coup in 2013. That was also very criticized by Brazil because, again, that idea that the South Atlantic should be handled preferentially by South Atlantic countries. And so that was clearly behind all those efforts, but that didn't mean or that implied that there was a very concrete and operational definition of what they should be doing in Africa. Another example would be that sometimes defense cooperation for Brazilian practitioners implies also the sale of Brazilian hardware, which again goes a bit counter to what we've been talking here. What should be capacity building? On the other question, I think Brazilians keep trying to invent the wheel in terms of finding new ways of communication between different ministries and between the armed forces and defense ministry and the foreign ministry. There have been quite a lot of mechanisms in place. There was a coordinator general coordinator for defense issues that started working around 2010. But the overall, inside the foreign ministry, inside the Itamaraty in Brazil, but Congress did not ratify the new guidelines for the foreign ministry, so it's not yet entirely legal, so to speak. But there are also some new divisions within Itamaraty which handle security issues. The problem, however, is also one of leadership behind this kind of ministries. And of course, a lot of developments were achieved because of the leadership of Celso Amorim. After 10 years ahead of the foreign ministry, it then went on for 4 years ahead of the defense ministry and was quite skillful in terms of occupying a void, so to speak, that the foreign ministry was leaving wide open. But now, I think just 2 weeks ago, they made a big fuss yet again of a new coordination mechanism between the defense ministry and the foreign relations ministry. And supposedly they are now trying to present this more cohesive public front, but it's yet unclear if that will translate into more concrete outcomes. I'll just point out on that note, because we were just talking about this during the break, that despite all that talk of more institutional dialogue between those actors, that hasn't cut into the purview of the Brazilian armed forces autonomy. And the case of Namibia, which I've worked quite a bit on the last few years, is quite a good example on that note, because it is the pet project of the Brazilian Navy, and it remains until today under the direct control of the Brazilian Navy. The budget, the operation, it's not the training of the Namibian military does not fall under the APC, but under the Brazilian Navy control. So that, I think, attests to the level of what Brazil still has to do in terms of becoming more cohesive in terms of who's leading what behind these kind of operations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we still have time for more questions or comments from the floor, here in Lisbon or in Porto. Okay, so I have a quick question for each one of you. Pedro, do you think that when we are speaking about Brazil, is Brazil really different? So there's this whole idea of South-South cooperation, of course, linked also with the idea of avoiding the presence of Westerners. But is Brazil different in terms of local ownership, of agenda setting? So this whole argument that, you know, the West is imposing its own agenda, is it different in the case of Brazil, or to a large degree it's the same? So it's still Brazilian driven, it's driven by Brazilian interests. You mentioned the importance of also of commercial sales of military equipment. Is that the case? Do you notice a difference there or not? To Antonio Pinheiro, I was just wondering, you mentioned the problems with this Guinean force that apparently was effective in terms of peacekeeping outside of Guinea and then came to Guinea and organized a coup. There is a lot of discussion about a potential tension between security sector reform, this whole idea of civil-military relations, ensuring accountability and civilian control, and actual military effectiveness. One example which is often cited is not African, but it's still pertinent, it's Iraq. So it's this idea that actually you did achieve significant results in terms of military effectiveness, but then civilian oversight actually destroyed it. So my question was, in your view, for instance, in the case of Guinea, the problem was the fact that these guys were very effective militarily and for the wrong reasons, so to speak. They organized the coup, they just wanted power. Or was it really a reaction to the fact that at the civilian level, you had real problems and real deficiencies? And so they were responding perhaps not in the right way, but there was a real problem of, yes, civilian oversight, but is it producing the right results, or is it creating problems of its own? So it's, and to some, you raise these very generic questions. And I think a basic one is this whole idea, how you translate lessons learned, best practices into actual practices. And my basic question is, well, if you take into account your knowledge of situation on the ground and of developments in terms of agenda setting for these topics, would you say generically that you see some progress in terms of achieving some of these best practices, greater coordination between donors, designing jointly programs with locals and also with different donors? Do you see some progress, or is it all just rhetoric and analysis? Thank you. So maybe we will do now the original order. We will start with Antonio and then Pedro and then Simon.
Okay. Thank you. That is actually a very interesting question. I would start by saying that from the strict military point of view, there's a huge difference between training a group of 200, say 300 soldiers for a 6-month period in order for them to join a multinational peace support operation force, and actually to build an effective battalion with modern standards of true operational effectiveness, being able to deal with low threat environments, operational theaters of operation, up until the level of high-intensity conflicts. What we have been doing in terms of security assistance in Africa, it's pretty much the former, not the latter. Hence, this notion that I have very clear that PSO operations and the motto which was launched by the United States after the disaster of the Black Hawk Down Mogadishu in '93, that Africans make the best peacekeepers in Africa, is misleading because there is no way you can compare the end result, the outcome of a training program, a 6-month training program, and a true military force with all these operational skills, combat readiness and effectiveness within the whole spectrum of military operations from low to high. So the example I pointed out was stemming from an experience that was led mostly for political gains and trying to look for this photo opportunity, and people forgot to take into consideration that this type of standalone, fragmented intervention has always bad consequences once the need is over. It's not, it was not even a matter of absence of democratic civilian oversight. As I recall, as I remember back in 2003, there was not even a democracy in Guinea-Bissau, much less a democratic civilian oversight. It was purely a matter of being the victims of, the military felt instrumentalized by being all padded up, and they lived like kings for almost 10 months. And when they got back to Bissau, they had no salary, no uniforms, no roof to sleep under, and no food. And the situation highlights many other examples across the whole continent where because of this fear of putting Western military, putting puts on the ground, and this new paradigm of this light footprint approach, it becomes really worrisome, because instead of investing and creating true structural capacities at the national level, we are investing funds and valuable time in training some kind of fictitious military forces that actually do not possess the necessary capabilities to be called as such. Maybe a group of men in battle dress uniforms, not necessarily a military unit.
Thank you so much. I think that is basically the million-dollar question regarding Brazil, because clearly Brazil has been doing things throughout the last few years. The question is really if it's doing any different, if it's doing any better, and if it's being any more effective than other countries are in this area. And I think what I tried to say is like the record is a bit mixed, There are clearly been some successes, there are clearly been some failures. But when regarding concepts as local ownership, agenda setting, we will constantly see that in official documentation, and Brazilian officials will make sure to stress those concepts in public and in private with African officials. But then you have to look at, well, the results and how the actual initiatives are processed. They are currently, most of these programs don't have accountability mechanisms, so there is no way of a company of keep track of the progress that is being done, and it's very, very context driven. So whenever the context changes, so do the initiatives and the limits of these initiatives, which brings this a whole degree of unpredictability about what will happen to them at the end of a political cycle or economic cycle, as we are now witnessing with regards to Brazil. And I will also point out
context-driven in terms of Brazilian politics.
Yes, mostly. And I think running counter what they say has been demand, basically responding to the demand by African countries. The Brazilian defense attaché network, which grew quite a lot in the last few years in Africa to cover more countries, they received updated instructions in 2011, I think, in which one of their mandates was actually to reach out to African officials and propose what this set of programs that I've been doing with Namibia, with Cape Verde, and see if they also wanted to experiment with Brazilian initiatives. So it's not that really demand-driven as they might want people to believe. But I think, just to conclude, one of the main issues with Brazilian cooperation and Brazilian capacity building, so to speak, is whenever it gets a bit hijacked by wider ambitions and wider foreign policy goals, as we were discussing about the South Atlantic. Because ultimately, it's not really the goal to assist, or maybe the primary goal is not so much to assist these African countries, but rather to enroll them into a common front that can be presented to the outside world as doing different. Not much interested in achieving that much of concrete gains, but rather presenting these countries as so connected amongst themselves that they can reap or multiply those gains in other international platforms and other issue areas. So there are those ulterior motives, so to speak, behind it, which clearly, in my view, compromises a bit of what they try to achieve.
Thank you, Bruno. Is there progress? Yes, there is some progress. There are also things that move in the wrong direction. What I think is progress is that in some developing countries, you see a new assertiveness, where they really claim the leadership over things that they should indeed be leading. You might be surprised if I mention Rwanda as an example. Rwanda is not a very democratic country, but it is a country with a strong and effective government, which tells the donors very clearly, ladies and gentlemen, these are the areas in which we need assistance. If you offer us something else, then we'll say thank you very much, but that's not what we need this year. Can you help us with that? Because that's where our need lies. So strong governments like the government of Rwanda will tell the donors very clearly, please, we would be very grateful if you helped us, but you need to help us in the areas which are our priorities. So I think this new assertiveness is very good in terms of local ownership, and I would like to see more countries adopting it. A second area of improvement, I think, is that some small, rich countries like the Netherlands have increasingly moved towards multilateralism in their development policy. So instead of giving a little bit of money here, there, and somewhere else, the Netherlands would say, let's support UNDP, or let's support the World Bank, because they have an operation on the ground, and maybe we'll get more economies of scale that way, which is, I think, fine as far as it goes. The problem is that the same lack of coordination that exists between national donors also exists between organizations like UNDP and the World Bank. I myself observed a World Bank program going into Congo-Brazzaville, which simply killed a very similar UNDP program, which was running already and fairly successfully. But the World Bank had more money and had more political clout, and of course it was more interesting for the government of Congo-Brazzaville because the World Bank works with governments, whereas UNDP tries to avoid working with difficult governments like the one in Brazzaville. So some progress there. But at the end of the day, allow me to repeat what I said to the lady over there, the donors will have to change some of their practices. There are also movements in the wrong direction, wrong in my opinion. There's a new program, a new policy at the EU called Capacity Building for Security and Development, which used to be called Train and Equip, which gives you an idea of its focus and its priorities. Now, this program will be providing aid to the military, which was not possible previously. That's not what worries me. In some cases, aid for the military can be perfectly legitimate and desirable. What worries me is more the narrow focus of train and equip, which I would have preferred to see very differently.
Okay, thank you very much. If the director allows me, then I will call it a day, and thank everyone for their very interesting comments and questions, and especially thank the speakers for their excellent presentations and engagement in the debate. So thank you for coming, and looking forward to future work with all of you. Thank you.